Welcome to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary, and this is the YouTube version of our podcast. To get the audio version, you can hop on over to Spotify or anywhere that you consume audio podcasts. We are going to jump into some really cool content, so stay tuned for our next guest. We look forward to connecting with you, and be sure to subscribe. And to start your author adventure, hop on over to o'learypublishing.com, where you can map out the entire process and see what writing a book would look like for you. Let's get started. Welcome back to the I'm Book podcast. I'm April O'Leary of O'Leary Publishing, and I'm super excited. Today, we have Mark Gottlieb, who is with the Trident Media Group, and he is a literary agent. He and I connected over Instagram, and that's the power of social media, right? Welcome to the show. So Mark just told me he's recording from home because his fiance has COVID and he has tested negative, thankfully, but you know, it's lucky for us in the world today that we can work remotely. And I'm glad to have you here. So let's talk a little bit about being a literary agent and how the heck did you start on that path?
Okay. Well, I think for most people, being a literary agent or being in publishing for that matter, it's kind of has always been this accidental profession. People kind of knew it existed doing, working in publishing. They didn't necessarily know the way in or actually always intend to do that. It was a lot of people just sort of stumbling out of the humanities. Maybe they were an English major, a history major, or something. And when I explain what I do, a lot of people didn't know this kind of job exists. And I have to sort of position it in their minds and saying, being a literary agent is sort of like being a talent agent, but specific to authors and their books and all of the manifestations a book can take, whether that be a movie or a TV show or what. And, as for me, my journey was probably different than most in publishing. I happened to work at my family business. So my family owns the company where I work. And so it was always sort of known I would go and study something that would be conducive to me going into the family business, as it were. And so at the time, there was only one undergraduate study for book publishing in the country, one or two. I think the better of the two was Emerson College. And so I decided to go there because I thought, I could go and do French comparative literature or something like that, but then what would that teach me about working and publishing or running a business? I would know how to read books, and analyze them and what have you, but that would be the extent of it. So that's sort of.
So you graduated from college with a degree in publishing?
Right. So Emerson offered a degree, they called it a writing, literature, and publishing degree. And it was literally the first year or two where they had created that major. And so they were building a curriculum at the school. And as a student, you could tell that that's what they were doing because it was very, very limited. Most of what they had early on was like literature classes, writing classes, like most schools have, very little on the publishing side. And so they started bringing in local industry professionals in the Boston area from publishers like Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and elsewhere, to teach a class, for instance, whether it was a class on book marketing, then they would get someone who ran the book marketing department at, Houghton Mifflin to come and teach a course. Or, my book editing professor, he also worked as an editor in publishing. So that was kind of cool because I feel like with most professors people come across in school, they're kind of, this is not to cast aspersions, but a lot of professors, they're kind of, I don't want to say stuck in academia, but they haven't necessarily gone out into the world and practiced what they're actually teaching. Like, yes, maybe they've published or this or that. Sometimes you find people who are adjuncts, but it was cool because these were actual people who had real lived experiences. And it wasn't just like reading something out of a book, it was just right there in front of you.
That must have been really interesting. And it's funny that you say stumbling into publishing. That's absolutely how I ended up doing this, was having written a book that I realized back in 2012 wasn't probably going to be picked up by a traditional publisher. I didn't have any clout or name recognition or anything. And so I went the independent self-publishing route. And over the course of the next number of years, wrote other books and then started having people asking me, how are you doing it? And I was like, could I do that as a business? And so it became a way to help people grow into potentially a traditional publishing deal. You never know where books can take you. And that's one of the things I love about publishing. So let's talk about some of the authors you've worked with or books that you have brought to market that have just maybe really exceeded your expectation, or you onboarded someone, and how did that work out for you?
Okay. Well, just looking back maybe at some of my more recent deals, I had done a six-figure plus deal for this debut author, Elwin Cotman. He was up for the Philip K. Dick Award, which is sort of this like literary award for science fiction and fantasy writers. And we sold it to Scribner, which is part of Simon and Schuster, and it was deal of the day on Publishers Lunch, and it was also featured in Publishers Weekly magazine, and so it was great. We only sold it off of 50 pages too, which is not easy to do for fiction.
Wow. So how did he, as a debut author, attract your attention as a literary agent? What was it that he had that made him marketable?
I reached out to him because he had a short story collection, which was published by a small press. I think it was with they were called actually Small Beer Press. And the story collection was up for that award. And so I reached out to him and I asked him if he was working on a novel. And he said, yeah, I have a few different ideas for various novels. So that's how that came about.
Wow, that's really interesting. Having not as much experience with the side of the industry you work on, it's something that I find so fascinating, because most of the time we hear the traditional, write your query letter, your proposal, and try to attract the attention of a literary agent. So it seems like it's this grappling to try to find someone who will, recognize that maybe you have something, and maybe that's because you have a big following on Instagram or whatever. But so it can go the other way as well, where as a literary agent, you kind of have your eyes on the landscape, and you can see almost like a scout. Like my youngest daughter plays travel volleyball. She's going to be a sophomore in high school this year. And when you go to these big travel volleyball tournaments, there are college scouts there. And so if you're playing well, they may come over to you and try to start that relationship. So is that a fair comparison?
Yes, it's similar in a lot of ways, although we do have scouts in our industry, but they do something slightly different. They really help to cover material for publishers. That's almost like a conversation for another time. But yeah, in a sense, we scout out talent, we find them, and then we help plug them in their book, into a publishing house. To use a good, maybe nonfiction example, there was a six-figure deal I did recently with Thomas Nelson. They're the Christian imprint of HarperCollins, and the author they bought is this woman by the name of Stephanie Nelson, who also goes by the name of the Coupon Mom. So talk about an author platform. Well, I can't think of a better example of just building a platform organically from the ground up. But her story is interesting. A lot of this happened before she met me, but her family was very poor, and in order to help make ends meet, to feed her family and what have you, she would use coupons. She would clip coupons, and she got so good at this. She found methods of doing what she calls stacking coupons, where she could get excess food and excess, household items. And her garage was just stocked with this stuff. And she thought to herself, well, I don't really need this stuff. I'm not going to sell this stuff. But she's very religious. She's a devout Christian woman. And so she decided to donate these goods to her church. And I guess Oprah found out about this, had her on her show a bunch of times, and she's been on other shows, and she just kind of got dubbed the coupon mom. So this new book we did for her is sort of about her journey, to that point, and just what it was like for her.
Hmm.
A little bit about the digital world of coupons too.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely changing for sure. I haven't quite bridged into that, not paper couponing or digital. But, I have watched some of those shows with those extreme couponers, and I know exactly what you're talking about. And I can imagine the readership for that kind of book would be quite large, especially with the platform that she's built.
With the platform, and unfortunately, given the times we're living in too.
Yes. So for those examples that you've given, one of them was someone that you scouted out because they had won an award for some short works. The other one had a platform that they built. Are there other ways that people can trickle into literary agent relationships?
Well, I think it boils down to basically two things, and one pertains to each, whether you're an author of fiction or nonfiction. In the world of fiction, it's just all about quality of writing, and by extension of that, an author will become a household name. So for instance, there's an author I found, I sold his book. I said to him, who are you? Where'd you come from? He said, well, I'm still in college and I manage a megaplex in Canada. And I thought to myself, okay, that makes sense. Like, he's been watching movies all day for free, as many as he wants, pretty much, and gets a feel for storytelling.
Hmm.
It didn't matter, like, did he come from a prestigious MFA program or any of that? That was all bells and whistles. In the world of nonfiction, it's like what you described earlier. You need to have a big platform, or a way to convince publishers there's a platform there, big reach or audience. So it can mean any number of things, like a big newsletter subscriber base, lots of website visits, doing speaking engagements, or having like 1 million social media followers, things like that. So that's what sort of convinces publishers in that space, because they really want that audience kind of already baked in.
It's really interesting how the two different types of genres really do warrant different strategies, and that it seems as though, if a college kid who's working at a theater but wrote a great story can break in, it's hopeful, right? That creative writers that are out there with good stories can build a brand. But how does that work? And maybe this is getting too far into the publishing arrangement, but for, let's say, this kid who's got a great story who really doesn't have a following, then the publishing, the deal that you strike was based on the quality of his book, essentially, right?
Well, in the nonfiction space, on the rare off chance we can sell it without much of a platform there, or just trying to convince publishers there's a platform there, the only thing really left then is sort of the idea, how unique the idea is, because nonfiction is really idea driven, and that's one of the main reasons why you can sell it off of a proposal with like a sample chapter or two, whereas novels need to be sold on a full manuscript, because editors want to know how the story is going to end and all that. Of course, quality of writing is not important to nonfiction, but I think the reason for this, and it wasn't always this way, and I wasn't in publishing at the time to see this, but from what I hear, with nonfiction, it wasn't always about the platform. Of course, publishers love that, but at a certain point, they started almost making it like a mandatory thing, that an author really needed a platform to get a nonfiction book sold. I think it probably has to do with Obviously, changes in the industry over time, but nonfiction actually sells in smaller numbers on the whole than fiction. The advances tend to be lower. It doesn't sell in as numbers that are as big as fiction, but you can sell a lot more nonfiction. A lot of agents tend to work more so in that space because they can kind of churn book deals
Mhm,
and sell them off of proposal, which is much easier than trying to sell a full length novel, to a publisher.
mhm. I love the confirmation that really some of the things we've been teaching around here are actually true, verifiable, I shall say now, by a literary agent, which is great. And it's the reason why back in 2012, it was the one thing I learned. I went with my little manuscript in my bag and knowing absolutely nothing about publishing. I was a life coach at the time, and I went to a publishing writers workshop put on by a larger sort of self-help publisher that at the time I thought would be like my dream publisher. And I really learned from that experience that it was all about your platform. And so it gives me the um, it gave me the sort of push to learn what I needed to learn because the book at that time served a tool for my business. And that's sort of the difference, I think, too, and some of the ways people choose to publish. Because obviously working with a literary agent to get a deal or an advance and all that, really the publishing company has to know you're going to sell copies of your book. Not that you're going to be a realtor and you're going to, sell one extra home this year, because your book gave you extra credibility, right? So in this world of literary, working with literary agents, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see prospective authors making?
Oh my gosh, there's so many, but you know, that's why I try to only focus on the few things people can do right. Because if they just could focus on that, don't have to worry about all kinds of mistakes they could make. But I've seen lots of things. I think the simplest one or the most common one is probably, I think in querying an agency, it's best to go through the website, use their submissions form. And the reason for that is mostly that the agencies like to track their submissions that way. And they like to, have the authors agree to their terms and conditions. So, really, for legal reasons. Um, but to just pick up the phone and call an agent and just say, hey, would you like to publish my book? It's not the best use. I would say like a hopeful writer's time. I think learning the querying process and going through that. Um, and I want to also speak to something you said before, which is, and maybe this ties into your, the coaching business. You said a little bit, but there are also authors who, they feel like sort of what you described. They feel cart before the horse. Oh, I have my book all ready to go. I wanted to get it published. Oh, wait a minute, I need a platform. How do I even conceive of that or build a platform? And there are actually ways of doing it, and it does indeed happen. Like I use that example. Um, but yeah, beyond that, there are other means to get a book out there in the world too, and sometimes successfully too.
Mhm. So, in your experience, what would be some of your best advice for aspiring authors who either have that novel or have that nonfiction, self-help book, like any words of wisdom impart to them to say, don't give up.
Well, it's a process, and because publishing is such a highly subjective business, they need to really have a lot of grit about them and realize that it's like I was at the MoMA once with my younger sister, and we were not the MoMA. You know what it was? It was the Louvre, and big difference. And we were looking at the Mona Lisa, and my sister said to me, "I don't understand. Why is that in this museum?" it's not a big deal. It's a tiny painting, and so many people are gathered around it. And I was like, I couldn't handle it. I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. This thing is worth millions and millions of dollars, you know. And but she was also justified at the same time in what she said. Just because it's widely accepted something's a masterpiece, like there are going to be also people who feel otherwise. So that's a big thing I think to keep in mind. And I hope that keeps people going in their process.
That is true, and it's funny how um, different people like to read different types of books, and it's interesting that maybe the reason I publish nonfiction is because that's mostly all I read is nonfiction. But I did read a few years back Where the Crawdads Sing, which came out a number of years ago and now just came out as a movie
Mm,
and is still selling like incredibly well. And
mm.
I don't know much about the backstory. Do you know the backstory of that book?
Well, that author had been publishing for a while. She and her husband, they were kind of radicalized nature conservationists, and so they would publish kind of pop science books about what it was like saving the animals in Africa from poachers. And then I guess just very much later in life, she decided to write fiction. And so prior to that, her only experience in writing were the nonfiction books, which, you know, that's sort of apples and oranges.
Hmm.
And it got picked up, you know, by this publisher, Putnam Books, and was kind of like a runaway success out of nowhere. I asked my colleagues sometimes, how did all that happen? And one of my colleagues, she said, because, you know, Putnam is part of Penguin Random House. Crawdads was such a big book because Penguin Random House decided it would be.
Hmm.
And it makes sense. You know, they put a lot behind that publication. So,
Yeah. It's interesting to think that because that author, I'm sure, could have probably never dreamed of what would happen. Sort of like we all know J.K. Rowling's story with Harry Potter and being rejected so many times. And now, I was just in Orlando and, Universal has an entire park, dedicated. Two parks have areas that are dedicated to Harry Potter, and people just absolutely live and die by Harry Potter. And it's like that whole vision she had writing in the coffee shop and sending her manuscripts in and facing all these rejections. I can't imagine if I was a literary agent at that time and I had rejected Harry Potter, how I would feel today.
well, there was the way it was found. I mean, I think it was found in a slush pile. Some people say it was an editorial assistant, other people say it was someone else, but it was basically found in a slush pile. And, you know, but it was good storytelling, and that was all that mattered in the world of fiction. And I think, in a way, in nonfiction, it's true too, because if it's a well written book, if it's a fascinating and unique idea, you know, the only thing you have left to do is get the platform going. And I think it's really easy to kind of kickstart that engine if that is all in place. There are a lot of venues online, places that will kind of open themselves to that story. You know, I'll give another example. We're actually out on submission with this author's book right now. Client of mine, Thomas Tursich. He was just a teenager in Pennsylvania. Two of his friends died at a very young age for different reasons, and it was a lot for him to deal with. So he took his dog and he decided to just start walking around all of planet Earth on foot. He's the 10th person in the world to do so, but the first person to do so with his dog. It took him about 7 years. And now he's getting a ton of media attention. I mean, he's been on Good Morning America and what have you. But before that, he was just a teenager out of Pennsylvania who went for a long walk with his dog. So that's my point with nonfiction. I think the platform is there and it's sort of waiting, and it just needs to sort of be tapped into.
So if someone's already walked around the world, what could I do? Maybe roller skate around the world? We're all just getting that much. Let's see what else can I
Well, I
do?
mean, everyone has a story. You know, no one that wants it written on their headstone. It's something like, "Oh, he never got around to writing that book" or something. You know, I feel like everyone's got a story to tell. So,
I agree. It's one thing I say frequently is I don't think anyone on their deathbed says, I shouldn't have written that book.
yeah.
Yeah, whether you write something that maybe is just memorable for your family. We had an author a couple years ago. This is kind of a funny story, and those who are listening now have probably heard it before, but I'll share it with you. He was a 85-year-old gentleman who I heard speak at a local clubhouse here, and his story just moved me to tears. And it was like one of those sort of moments where you feel like if there is a higher power, it's tapping on your shoulder and saying, this man needs to publish his book,
Mm.
and I didn't know him, and I'm not a traditional publisher. I'm not out, hunting down the next best story. And obviously he's not looking to build a platform. He was in a wheelchair and on oxygen. It was like kind of this whole weird cluster of events. And so anyways, I ended up reaching out to him and saying, hey, Win, I heard you speak yesterday. And I just, I know this is a crazy idea, but I feel like you need to put your story in a book. And he was like, oh, April, I don't really write anymore. And I was like, oh, that's such a bummer. He goes, but I do have a 70,000 word manuscript sitting here on my shelf that I tried to get published 10 years ago.
See, everyone's got a story in them just waiting.
So yeah, we ended up publishing it for him, and within a year he died. We had a big book signing for him just locally here in Naples, Florida. Tons of people came out, and it was just sort of like this feather in his cap. And we didn't know he would pass within a year. But his kids who live out in California have since, come here, and they thanked me profusely for doing that for him. And it was just sort of like a whole feel good experience. And I think that even though his book never reached far and wide and the masses or anything, it was meaningful enough to a small enough group of people that it was worth it for him.
Oh yeah, I mean there are lots of different reasons to put the story out there into the world, and that meant a lot to him and his family for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll ask, just on the process and how it works, with securing and working with a literary agent. I mean, we've talked about building your platform and having a good story, and we've talked about, submitting through a website to make sure that you're, not just wasting people's time by trying to call and get the attention of an agent. But once an agent, you build that connection and somehow you get the deal where let's say, Mark, you really like me. And so you could see I've built my platform, and now we're working together. Then what happens?
Okay. So yes, assuming all that has happened, then usually the agent will offer a like an agency agreement for the author to sign, or at least an understanding of their working relationship in email. And then from that point, the agent would craft a pitch and a list of editors along a submission. They'd go out, submitting the book, field offers that were to come in, negotiate to the best of terms, and then present the author with an offer from a publisher. And if the author decided to accept, then the publisher sends forth their publishing agreement. The agency reviews it. If everything's good, then the author signs off, the publisher signs off, and the publisher pays a book advance, typically like a large lump sum of money for the chance to publish the book, and with a set of royalties and all that. And all monies and agreements would then flow through the agency, be commissioned by the agency at 15%, which is just standard across the industry. And then 85% of the monies go to the author, along with a fully signed copy of their agreement, an accounting of all that, royalty statements as they were to come in. So that's the deal making process right there. But more obviously happens after that through the publishing process itself. So, but yes, that is the deal making process right there in a nutshell.
So would it be fair to say it's kind of like a a realtor is helping you find the right house for yourself.
Yes.
Except that it's a publishing house, it's not a physical house, and they understand, and then they would present you with like, how about this, or how about that, or and
It is, that is probably the closest thing to what we do, because it's not like a realtor says to you, pay me and then I'll sell your house. They take a commission for selling your house.
Mhm.
Um, and so all their work is pretty much commission based. So instead of a realtor selling an apartment or a house, we're selling intellectual property, not real property, but intellectual property. And I would say the only other, the only difference is, now that's if you're a home, you're selling your home. But if you're buying with the help of a real estate agent, you know, their commission can sometimes be a little different when they're buying, when you're doing the buying, because the commission is usually based on the price of the home.
Mhm.
So they're incentivized a little differently that way. But in our line of work and what I do, we uh, are really aligned with the author. It's a symbiotic relationship. If the author does well, we do well. If
Mhm.
they don't stand to benefit from something, well, why would we do that? Because then we won't benefit either. So
Right.
very
Well,
mutual.
it's been very, very interesting hearing all about your work and your world and your contribution to the publishing industry. And I really appreciate your time today, Mark, and sharing some of this with us. I hope it's been helpful to you as a listener today to understand the difference between really trying to secure that traditional publishing deal, which most people who write a manuscript initially have their dreams of, and what it takes to actually achieve that. So how can people get in touch with the Trident Media Group, and where's the best way for them to
Uh,
connect and submit anything they might have?
Probably just starting with our website, tridentmediagroup.com. There's a lot of good information there. You can see our information about the company, our social media channels, all of that. So I would say that's the best place for them to start.
Perfect. Well, I will include the links to the Trident Media Group in our show notes. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your
Likewise.
time,
Thank you.
and hope you get a huge bestseller sometime in your near future.
That
That would
would be
be
great.
amazing. Yeah, that's
Thank
the hope
you.
for every author. So thank you so much and have a great day.
All right.
So this has been another episode of the iBook Podcast. I'm April O'Leary signing off. Be sure to hop on over to o'learypublishing.com to start your author adventure and see what writing a book could do for you in your profession, in your career, and what doors it might open. We thank our guests for being a part of the show today, and be sure to subscribe to podcasts here on YouTube. We look forward to serving you and helping you get your book out into the world.